Welcome to A Case for America. I am Austin Hepworth. I'm here along with Michael Hepworth. And today we are talking about the 14th Amendment and equal protection. And today we're going to use sports as one of the main topics that we'll be looking into. So it's a current societal issue, trying to decide on what level of participation is proper in sports. We have traditionally had boys and girls sports, men and women's sports. And with there being trans movement now and more acceptance of that, there is a big debate about whether someone that used to be a boy that now is transitioned to be a girl can play on girls' teams. Or there's not as much debate the other way, I don't think. But there still is discussions about how do we separate out our teams? How do we do these things? How do we look at this? And so as we're going through these things, I think it'll be pretty important to recognize what at least we are approaching this from. We show this in a lot of our podcasts, but it's a scale. Anarchy's on one side, tyranny's on the other, liberty's somewhere in the middle. And laws are necessary to pull us out of the state of anarchy or the state of vice of humans doing awful things that we've seen throughout history. We create some level of society, some level of togetherness, and that's a point of liberty. But we also don't want the law telling us everything. We don't want the law dictating all possibilities. And so on the one side of the scale, to avoid tyranny, we have to have morality. We have to have private solutions. We have to have the ability for people to solve problems on their own without the law solving it. And so as we look at this today, as we talk about sports, the 14th Amendment, equality, some of these things, you want to definitely keep this image in your mind. Think about the balance between anarchy and tyranny, because there is an interesting balance to look at with what's taking place. But with that, to throw out quickly, the 14th Amendment has a number of things in it. Quite a few different things come from the 14th Amendment. It's one of the longer amendments, and we'll have a number of podcasts on the 14th Amendment. This won't be the only one. We'll even have to talk about things like President Trump, and there's disqualification potentially. Colorado at least disqualified him from the ballot. That's been appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. These are pieces that are all part of the 14th Amendment, and they all came after the Civil War. So the first thing the 14th Amendment does is it says, hey, if you're born in the U.S., you're a citizen of the U.S. And that was to overturn a case actually which held that slaves, even freed slaves, weren't necessarily citizens. And so, and then it goes on, the 14th Amendment goes on to say, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. That line, that due process, was seen in the Fifth Amendment, but the Fifth Amendment only applied to the federal government. This now applies to the states. So the 14th Amendment's coming in, and where the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments, restricted the federal government, the 14th Amendment is now restricting states. So it's a pretty expansive amendment in that it's now imposing limitations on state action, which didn't exist prior to this. The last line that we'll talk about today is nor deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. So when it comes to equal protection of the laws, we have to look at and ask the question, what does that mean? What does it mean to have equal protection? Does it mean that, some people argue that, well, that means that we should have as much as somebody else. That means if I don't have a house, I should have a house. There's a big push in society right now. We've changed the term from homeless to unhoused. And homeless infers that I didn't do something, I didn't pay my bills, so I'm homeless. Unhoused infers that someone didn't house me, and it's putting the responsibility outward on somebody else. And when we have the news talk about unhoused individuals, to me, from what I see as an attorney, they're starting to try and create this argument that the law is required to provide housing. We can't treat people differently. Now, have they fully gone to that extent? No. I believe they're building a case for it. But it begs the question of what is equal treatment? And what is equal treatment under the laws? Or, I guess I even said the wrong word. The law doesn't say equal treatment, it says equal protection of the laws. So Michael, curious if you have any thoughts initially on things we should be looking at and determining what's equal protection under the laws.
Yeah, I initially didn't understand this well. Based on what I hear people talk about, you mentioned people saying, well, we should give equal benefits, opportunities, treatment to individuals. But the amendment talks about equal protection of the laws. And so we first have to look at it. What that's doing is kind of restricting the equal protection to a law that may exist. So as Congress passed a law that applies to something, and then is that law being applied without equality to different individuals? Just as a very simple example, if there's a law that you can't drive, you have to keep the speed limit, you can't drive faster than the speed limit, and they're only pulling over the red cars, there's perhaps an argument there of no equal protection because there's a law that exists. So I think there's a lot of discussion about making this more of a positive thing. Everybody deserves to have the same home, same amount of money, whatever it may be. For the most part, it's been limited to if there's a law that exists, that a law needs to apply equally across the board. The question, it starts to get confusing when what maybe used to be standard definitions, boundaries, change, such as when we talk about gender or sex or something like that. Maybe a long time ago, it was fairly well accepted, men and women, two distinct categories, and laws were put in place that provided a lot of equality between the two. And you can look at things like voting, or even you get more recent Title IX sports in schools where they said there's this many male teams, there has to be this many female teams. When those boundaries that used to exist start to change, then equal becomes something that's more difficult to understand, because now you have to apply it to a new domain of options. What does equal mean when we've decided that maybe that it's not just male and female, maybe there's more options if that's the way we've gone. And so as we look towards equality, we have to look at the domain of choices. And then we have to say, what does equal mean? I know that I, as an individual, want to be treated by my government in a similar manner as my neighbor. But I don't want the government to think I am my neighbor. I want them to know I'm a different individual. And especially when it comes to things like taxes. Maybe I don't want them to tax me like I'm my neighbor. Maybe they make more than I do, or something like that. So what does equal mean? That's kind of what we have to look at. How much individuality do we want to maintain? How much do we want to give up so that we can be looked at as equals? I think these are some of the bigger questions we have to kind of look through as we go through this.
Yeah, and it is interesting on the equal side, even because, again, going back to a strict reading of the 14th Amendment, it says equal protection of the laws. So to your example of speeding, if they were only pulling over males, or only pulling over females, or only pulling over red cars, or they had some criteria they were going off of, that wouldn't feel like equal protection under the laws. The laws are just supposed to apply and be there. And so obviously we had a huge equality issue with slavery. That's a very sad period to look at what took place there. But it's interesting, even with things like equal protection of the laws, because women didn't immediately get the right to vote after the Equal Protection Amendment was passed with the 14th Amendment. They still had to work really hard for 50 or so years before they got the right to vote. And so society's view of what this equal protection means has been in constant flux and kind of evolving with the morality of society. There was a time when the law said, separate but equal for Black students. As long as you have a school to go to and white kids have a school to go to, we can separate you two out. That's fine. That's equal. And we eventually got rid of that with race and said, no, that's not equal. Got to do away with that. But we've kept it with sports, where we say, as long as we got a guys team and a girls team, it's separate but equal, essentially, we've said. And even though everyone knows it's not equal, it's very different. If you're a football player, you're going to get way better treatment at a university than if you are, the cross country runner or something for the girls team. And so society in America, we've been dealing with this interesting concept where as the government provides more and more things to people, and the government says, okay, starting out, education used to be somewhat private, and that was how it was taken care of mostly. Then the government came in and said, let's start providing it because people need this. And somehow at some point, education became a part of sports, where now government-funded education is now funding sports programs. These sports programs are feeding private professional groups that make a crazy amount of money. And this is now happening at the taxpayer expense. And it's a real interesting, I don't honestly fully know the history of sports and how it came to be that every high school in America needs a football stadium and every college needs its own football team and a bunch of things. But it's interesting to start to unpack as we talk about equal protection of the laws, to say, are we on the right track with our government? Are the laws delving into the correct things? Or are some of the reasons we're having a bunch of these discussions about equal treatment, people like to say today, or equal protection, is it because maybe the government's taking on things it shouldn't be taking on? If you think about the balance, when the law is pulling us out of anarchy and saying it's not just, the dog-eat-dog world out there, we're going to establish some rules and norms. We want those to apply to everybody. But we also don't want the law telling us everything. And if we go into a really strict view of equality or equal protection, you can ask questions such as, okay, we're talking about men and women in sports. And we've even talked about things like, and this is as a society, we've talked about these things about diversity in selecting who gets into school. And so universities will say, oh yeah, we want a very diverse group of people. We want it to match kind of societies and what it is. So if there's X percent of Latinos or whites or anything, we want to get that in here. And there are people that really like those, people that are very upset by those. But if you take it and apply in a slightly different context, you say, okay, what about the NFL? What about college sports? Do they have to be representative of the population as a whole, those teams? And so are we going to say now that a football team has to have X percent of Latinos on it? If you look at the NFL, less than 1% of players in the NFL state that they're Latino. It doesn't mean that Latinos aren't good at sports. There's some crazy, amazing athletes that do all kinds of things, but so far football hasn't been their thing. And from a percent of America perspective, there's far more Latinos than less than 1% in America. But that's not cohesive among sports. And so these universities that are very aggressive about pursuing this balanced approach to their student body haven't done the same with sports. Their team isn't reflective of society as a whole. But then you can even break that down further to say, okay, well, so if we're going to get X number of people, because we want everything to be the same and equal and all these things, do you need to get a certain number of Christians at your school and a certain number of Jews at your school and a certain number of Buddhists at your school? Does religion matter in that? Why do we pick certain characteristics and not others? And when we really start to go down this rabbit hole of trying to make everything equal, I think we quickly start to realize it's nearly impossible to do. There's so many factors associated with life. And to your point, Michael, we value the law treating us the same, but we also really highly value the law recognizing we're not the same. And I think it's this competing balance between anarchy and tyranny. We want our basic needs met, but we do want freedom to paint our house the way we want or to buy something we want versus we don't want. We want freedom to be an individual still. And if we push equality to its extreme, it takes out that freedom. And so as a society, we have to then opt and say what things we care about being equal and what things we're going to allow individuals to be free on. And that ultimately is a moral decision we're making as a society. Is one that we've been very hard on, and as far as I know, pretty hard and fast, is we have come down pretty hard to say different ages can be treated very differently based on the age you are. You can have entire sets of rights given or removed based on certain ages. And, in the ongoing debate about whether you can identify as a man or a woman if you were the opposite before, some people will post things of a pro Major League Baseball player there with the 5-year-olds hitting a home run on the T-ball set, saying he identifies as a 5-year-old. And so far, we haven't allowed people to identify as a different age, but we are allowing them to identify as a different sex or have different, to claim they have different gender than perhaps their physical characteristics associated with that. And again, from a philosophical standpoint, there may or may not be reasons to say age is different than sex characteristics. Some people argue it's the same. Some people argue they're different. But ultimately, from a legal perspective, we are drawing a distinction there to say, we can say that you're 15, you can only compete with 15-year-olds. No matter how much you want to go compete with 25-year-olds, they don't have to let you on the team. We're going to discriminate against you as a 15-year-old. And again, that's necessary for some level of order to exist. But it just highlights the point that equal protection can't mean equality in every sense of the word. And back to your point, Michael, it's got to mean something associated with laws and laws that exist, as in limiting what it can or can't apply to. Because, if the law required everyone to be the same, it would essentially become tyranny at that point. It'd have to dictate everything that we do and say. But with that, diving in to look at the sports issue a little bit more in education, we have a situation right now where there's an ongoing debate about whether someone that used to be male and has transitioned to be female can participate in female sports. As far as I know, in many sports, males have more records, I guess, associated with it. I don't know. They tend to be the top of the sport. If you look at things like soccer, football, baseball, basketball, the competition isn't the same between the best men and the best women. Now, obviously, there's a woman in every sport that can beat other men, but we're talking about the top of the sports. There tends to be a pretty strong distinction in many sports between men and women. And so if you allow someone that says they are female to simply join, then we start to have situations where suddenly a lot of the female records are getting broken, such as with swimming. That's been happening recently. Obviously, there's some sports that men may really struggle with if they tried to switch over and be female. I think of gymnastics as an example. I don't know if men would dominate if they were doing all the same things that female gymnasts were doing. But that's just a one-off example. But looking at these, the question becomes, in order for there to be equal protection of the laws under the 14th Amendment, do schools, government-run schools, have to let someone that's declared on their driver's license, declared with the government records that they're female, do they have to let them join the girls' team? And so, Michael, I'm curious what you think on that question and maybe how we should look at that or the ways that society should evaluate that.
Yeah, there's been a lot of different opinions about this, I guess. Some of them go back to what you kind of referenced in competition-wise. Because generally speaking, if you look at things like, say, the 1 mile time, the record for the men for a mile is 3 minutes and 43 seconds, and the record for the women is 4 minutes and 7 seconds, which is a pretty massive difference in time. And so people just say, competitionally speaking, it's an entirely different world. Physically speaking, men quite naturally have larger lung capacity, more bone density, more upper body strength, just kind of naturally speaking. And so people say, competitionally, we should separate them out just for fairness. And you can see a lot of that. An individual who may not be one of the best in a men's competition might come over and do really well in a women's competition. And you could say maybe that's not fair. It's a tough distinction to make because when you're looking at the top, it's easy to see. But looking down below the top, there's lots of women that are better at a given sport than other men are. And you can find a woman that's better at a sport than a guy is. And so you say, should we just separate everything out by competition? How good you are. If you're good enough, you can play for this. If not, you can play for that. And some people have proposed that. Some people have said, well, for equal protection, you need to be able to play where you feel comfortable, because that's what equal protection means. Where do I feel like I belong? Problems with that might be, how does one decide if one feels comfortable or feels they belong? Is that too arbitrary, something to discuss in legal terms? And I think this kind of gets down to the nub of the issue. Are we asking the government to differentiate between some very specific characteristics of individuals? Are we saying to the government, you need to come in to this really nuanced category and tell us how we're supposed to properly divide things, when in a society we can't even figure it out? We're still trying to figure out good ways, and we can always point to examples where maybe we didn't do it right. And we want the government to come in and solve that problem. Back to your age question, I know I've seen basketball players, young, 12, 13 years old, that could, play as well as I do. Just some really great talent. LeBron James in high school was just dominating, but he couldn't go to the NBA until after high school. Do we say, based on age, he was good enough, he should just be able to go play? Or do we say, hey, this 40-year-old guy isn't very good, he should be able to go play in high school because that's his level of competition? And do we ask the law to come in and make those decisions for us? Perhaps, something we can consider is, do we ask the law to solve all of our problems for us, or are there human issues that are quite complex that maybe we need to leave in the hands of society? And maybe we can work, because back to my point, I don't know that society's been able to figure out where to draw the line. We continually go back and forth on what would be the right way to do this, what would be the wrong way to do this. Nobody in society can agree, and yet we look to the law to solve this for us. Should the law be asked to solve every problem we have? or should we as a society get together and say some of these things we can own to prevent the tyranny of the government are the decisions that we can make. If we ask the law to keep some baseline rules and standards so we can maintain our rights, are the things that we can own in a society. And the second part to that, I think, is when I said rights. Have we expanded the definition of rights to the point where we don't know what a right is, what it isn't, or we've asked the government to give us everything? Is it a right to play basketball? Do I have a right to that? And do we ask the government to then supply it because I've decided that I have a right to play basketball? We should be careful about expanding the definition of what we have rights to be able to do. I think those are maybe some of the things we should consider as we look to can we make laws that are going to solve this problem for us, or will it just continue to be a very complex issue?
Yeah, and I think it's interesting to talk about, well, let's say that we believe the law can solve the problem, and we talk about that. What happens if the law comes out and says, yes, trans kids can participate in female sports, or no, they can't? If they say yes, there's a lot of girls that may stop participating. They're not comfortable there. There is this whole nature of life that's an incredibly large industry in America associated with sexuality. And there is a real something that takes place between men and women, and also between men and women and women. There's all kinds of ways that things take place. But in general, you can almost guarantee that if you get a bunch of boys together and a bunch of girls together, that there will be some level of that aspect associated with those interactions. And so to give girls a place to participate where they don't have to be subject to that, don't have to be with those men or boys, for many is an important place to be. And if they're there now and there's that uncomfortableness of having a male or someone that's physically male or was physically male there, it introduces a different element. Now, does that mean that just because someone's uncomfortable with something, we don't do it? Not necessarily. People were uncomfortable with certain races for a long time, and the law said, you got to get comfortable and figure it out. To me personally, there's a big difference between race and sexuality and the interaction between the two different sexes. There's some strong, whether you view it as nature, God created, I don't care. There's some strong forms of attraction, strong things that happen, strong impulses that arise. And again, if you look at society, the porn industry, all kinds of things, incredible amounts of money flow to those types of things. I don't think we can credibly deny that there's not a difference. And I don't think it's fair at all to say to a girl or a boy, oh, just act like there's nothing there. It's like, no, that's not the way this works. You can't just pretend like this isn't a real difference. But if the law comes in and says yes or no, you could potentially shut out a lot of girls from wanting to participate in sports, or you could foreclose the opportunity for trans kids to participate in sports. And I look at it and I say, we're all human. We all deserve equal protection of the laws. I believe that. What does that fully mean? To me, it means that the law shouldn't be involved. I don't believe government, actually, to a base level, should be involved in sports. We're in so many of these issues because we viewed it's the government's job and the taxpayers' job to build high school football stadiums. Why are taxpayers paying for high school football stadiums? What educational value does that have other than to hope that it produces a feeder into the collegiate level, which then feeds into the pro level and people make millions of dollars and we celebrate it? And I'm not saying there's not some growth value that comes from sports. I believe strongly if you participate in sports, there's some real growth value. But why is it a taxpayer item? Why do I have to pay to fund someone else's kid to play basketball or play football, to build their stadiums and things? And then what happens with sports is that the government then implements programs and uses these facilities they've created with the taxpayer money. But they're not equally accessible to all private groups. And the way I see the resolution being for the trans sports issues that society's facing is just to allow private groups the ability to say either, hey, we let anyone can participate, just based on competition levels, like you said, Michael. If you can compete, you're in. We don't care what religion you are, we don't care what race you are, we don't care what sex you are. And let them see if they can make a go of it. If society's comfortable with that, cool. If it works with that sport, great. Show us it works. If there are people though that want to say, you know what, I want to create a women's only league, and it's for people born as a woman, or a men's only league, let them. I imagine with the diversity of life in America and the diversity of opinions, we'll get a lot of different sports leagues. And if we allow for this freedom of individuals to act, to take on private responsibility, I actually think the sports world is going to work itself out. It will work itself out as to what's appropriate and not with sports and things, based on what people are willing to do and not do. It's kind of like, I view it as the provision of, we can go to the store and we can buy butter and milk every time I go to the store, except during COVID. There's been everything I've needed. Maybe a handful of times there's something out of stock and I go, oh, that's annoying. But 98% of the time I walk into a store, it's got what I need. How does it have that? The law doesn't tell them how much to buy, what to put in place. They work it out. They go through experience. There's money paying in. There's people buying things. There's supply and demand. And let that supply and demand work itself out in sports. That's something I believe. And we could have a situation where there's someone that wants to play something and there's no one around to do it. You could be in a town where no one wants to play football, or no one wants to play soccer, or you don't have enough girls for wrestling. That was the thing when I wrestled. Girls started to say, I want to wrestle too. And they were demanding that they join the boys' teams. And while there was certainly some level of mockery if you lost to a girl when I was there in high school, the bigger thing for me was that religiously I was very opposed to rolling around with a girl on a mat. That was something that was absolutely a moral issue for me. I didn't feel it was proper for me to be in that kind of contact with a female. And when I wrestled, they came out and said, we're going to let girls into men's sports, into boys wrestling, because there's not enough girls to create a league. And so you guys have to wrestle a girl or forfeit the match. And I remember at the time there was a state champion from Iowa that forfeited a state match. And so he couldn't go on and be state champion because he'd have to wrestle a girl in that competition. She was obviously a good wrestler and made it really far in the weight class, but he felt morally opposed to that as well. And when the law comes out and picks winners and losers and says, yes, you have to, or no, you don't have to, suddenly people don't get the benefit of the law and the government and everything it's doing. But if people come out and say, you know what, you have the freedom to go create a league, you have the freedom to go drum up interest, you have the freedom to tell everyone why your way is the best way, go do it. Go create that league, whether it's female only, male only, or trans, or anything in between, all combined. Give people the freedom to do that. I believe the problems will work themselves out very quickly. I think though what's happening in society is as the government takes over more and more of our lives and gets into more and more things, it becomes that much harder. And the debates become that much more vicious because the law shouldn't even be there. The law shouldn't be involved in what sports are. Sports are a private affair, not the affair of a country, not the affair of government. Let sports do what sports does, and people will pay for what they want. People will pay for what they value. And there are many ways to create these groups and keep them going. There's many successful private groups that exist. And I look at it, sports as an example of when you look at equality and you start to apply it and things get off pretty quickly, it's probably a sign that the law's involved in something it shouldn't be. If the government had a stadium it built and someone wanted to use it and they said, no, you can't use it because you're female, or no, you can't use it because you're white, that wouldn't be equal protection of the laws. But to then take it a step further and say, oh, but the law, because the girls have a team, the boys have to have a team too, so we got to go make one, I think is really stretching this concept too far. It's not the role of government to make sure that the interests in society are all the same and everyone has all the same opportunities in life, because we never will. Life is so full of things to do. We're so different, so many talents and gifts that will never fully be the same. And so when we talk about the proper role of government, when we talk about what is the law's job, to me, the law's job is to create the, I guess what is a sports term, create the playing field and some basic rules that allow individuals then to address and solve moral problems. If there's a moral problem that some kids don't have sports to participate in, then let's step up and solve that. And guess what? We talk about some kids being excluded from sports. If we're honest, most kids in America are excluded from sports. They're just not good enough to really do good. No matter how much I want to be an NFL football player, I'm not good enough. I'm being excluded. And many, many kids can't hang with the kids that are really good at it. And so, to your point, Michael, if there's a 40-year-old that's only as good as the high schoolers, well, why can't he play? Or an 15-year-old that's good enough to be in the pros, why can't he go? Sports by nature discriminates because it rewards those that are better physically at it than others. And so we often talk about, well, what if there's a kid in some town that doesn't have enough interest? That might happen, but there's also 100,000 kids with interest that just don't have the talent, and somehow we're morally okay with that. And that's, again, part of life. And the law can't solve all these problems. It never will. And when it attempts to, it just creates more and more problems for itself. It gets stickier and stickier. I don't know if you have any further thoughts on any of that, Mike, or what you want to make.
Yeah, just to reiterate the point of, I feel for an individual that wants to participate in something but can't because of some circumstance, whether there's not enough interest or something else going on. But I hesitate to say that the role of government is to go in and find everybody's interests and then allow them an opportunity to participate in their interests. I don't know that that's the kind of, that seems really tyrannical by a government to be able to do that. And it seems that those kinds of interests are better met by individuals looking for ways in society with the freedom they have to do whatever they're interested in. I think an example of that can go back to sports. Many youth, like you say, are excluded based on just talent level. And individuals say it's about hard work. Yes, but it's also about what talent you're born with. Two individuals, one born with a lot of talent, one born without it, a lot of physical gifts, not. They can both work the same hard at a given sport. And the individual who's born with a lot of the physical characteristics is going to make it, and the other individual won't. And I think our society in many places has done a fairly good job of also trying to come up with solutions for individuals that maybe just aren't as good at something naturally. There's a lot of non-competitive sports leagues out there, and they continue to grow, and people continue to start their own. Just looking for an outlet for individuals that want to participate but maybe won't be able to make a competitive team. And I think we should give more opportunity for that. We should. What happens when we ask the government to come in and solve these problems is opportunities for those kinds of things diminish. And we ask for a centralized body of individuals to come and solve a lot of really diverse problems. And so, to your point, we need to open up for society to answer some of these problems. If there's individuals who want to participate in something and can't find a way, well, let's get some ingenuity, let's get some creativity over there, let's find a way. Let's not ask for the government to come in with its heavy hand and make a solution that just kind of sets everybody as though they're the same, because they're not. We're not the same. We want to be treated the same to a point, but we're not all the same people. We like our individuality. Too much government comes in and it just makes us all become the same drone that the government interacts with. And so the government role seems to properly fit to supporting a very baseline set. Let's make sure individuals are treated right by proper laws, and let's let society solve a lot of the issues that we run into.
Yeah, that's really where I've come to with a lot of the discussion on trans participation in sports. Is I say, if we just let individual groups start their own leagues, start their own things, do that, and then just say from the beginning, it's all inclusive or it's somewhat restricted or whatnot. I really think we'd have an incredible amount of problems work themselves out. And then these groups can show whether physical differences are necessary for competition or not. Because maybe there's some sports where they're not. I know the Olympics is requiring that each sport go through and articulate whether there is actually a difference between men and women participating in those. I look at some and I think, yeah, rifle shooting, is there any advantage to having bigger lungs and being stronger in rifle shooting? I don't know. But again, it's fascinating to look at because those are general male characteristics. There's obviously plenty of men that aren't super strong, that don't have the bigger lungs, and they're excluded from sports almost completely because they don't have a place to compete. And I still think that if the law was built to say, let's give you an equal footing, meaning, yep, these facilities that we've created can be used by individuals, by private groups, by different things. There's a lot of neat opportunities that could come. There's a lot of things that can be built. But when the law says, oh, we got to go create it, we got to go get people in it, it's this huge, heavy burden on government, huge, heavy burden on taxpayers. And I don't personally believe that's what the 14th Amendment is requiring of us. Because again, even after the 14th Amendment, women didn't have the right to vote still until they got a future amendment. And I'm not saying that that was correct necessarily, but to me, it was clear at that point in history, they weren't contemplating a lot of these things that we're discussing today. It was written for some very different things. So as we go on with Case for America and talking about these issues, we'll dive a little bit more into the 14th Amendment, how it has been applied, maybe some of the ways the courts haven't applied it, and probably look at some of the ways they're arguing it for it to apply as well. And there's a lot of real interesting discussions here in the 14th Amendment about what it means. But ultimately, we encourage you to think about, from a moral perspective, what do we have to do to solve the problems? The law is not going to solve all of our problems. We're too unique, too different for a law to be able to solve all those. So why trust it to the law? Why not give it to the free market that's produced all the computers and all the phones and all the variety we need to fulfill every different need? We can do the same. People are, they have ingenuity, they have drive. People solve problems if you give them the level playing field to be able to do that with from a legal perspective. And so we appreciate you being with us today, and we will follow up more next week as we go through more of these. Thanks so much.